This video is on the founding documents. The founders of the United States had been studying law and governments before the U.S. even existed. So before we had a United States, before we had a Constitution, the people who made our Constitution had already been studying the best kinds of law and the best governments. These people were John Adams, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Hancock, George Mason, and George Washington. Each of these men and many others had been spending their lives studying governments and law. So when it came time for them to create their own government, they already knew what might work and what might not work. The founding fathers had read earlier documents to help them create the U.S. government. In your notes, fill in the word documents. When they were reading earlier documents, they thought about what they wanted to bring to the new U.S. government that they were creating. So all those founding fathers would have conversations and debates with each other based on the documents they'd read, the philosophies they understood, the ideas they had. So a conversation could be like John Adams saying, "I like free speech," and Ben Franklin saying, "That sounds great, let's add it to the Constitution." Or George Washington saying, "I think the leader should follow the laws," and Jefferson saying, "Me too." Or Hamilton saying something like, "Let's add religious freedom." So these men were having conversations. Our government didn't just appear. It was based off of debates and conferences and conventions and discussions and arguments about what these people thought would be the best way to create our government. There are many earlier documents that influenced the Constitution, but we're going to talk about 4 of them: the Magna Carta, the Virginia Company of London, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Notice that 3 of these documents came out of the state or colony of Virginia. Virginia was a very important colony and then a very important state, and a lot of important founding fathers came from Virginia. So they had written a lot of documents that then influenced the Constitution. The first one we're going to look at is the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was written in 1215 in England. So right now it's 2022. This document was written in 1215. At the time, the King of England had all of the power, and he didn't always have to follow the laws. He could kind of do whatever he wanted, and that made the people in England nervous and scared and angry at times. And so in 1215, they got the King of England to agree to sign the Magna Carta. It created rule of law in England, where everybody, even the king, had to follow the laws when they didn't have to before. Fill in your notes on the Magna Carta now. The next one we're going to look at are the charters for the Virginia Company of London. The Virginia Company of London created the colony of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in Virginia. So these charters were created in 1606, and they were written in England. And what was happening is that the colonists that were moving to America were Englishmen. They were from England, even though they didn't live there. So they were still Englishmen, even though they were living in America. And people didn't know what rights they would have. Do they have the same rights as the people living in England? Do they have different rights? Do they have more rights? Do they have less rights? People didn't know. And so these charters were written, and what they did was they gave rights to Englishmen everywhere. Even the citizens of England that weren't living in England had the rights of Englishmen. Fill in your notes on the charters for the Virginia Company of London now. The third one we're going to look at is the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Here is a quote from that document: "All men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights." The Virginia Declaration of Rights was written in 1776. That's the same year as the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was brainstorming for the Declaration of Independence, and he started by writing this Virginia Declaration of Rights. And so this becomes the basis for the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And what it does is it lists the rights that people inherently or automatically have just by being alive. Fill in your notes on the Virginia Declaration of Rights now. The last one we're going to look at is the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And so here's the top of it. It says, a bill for establishing religious freedom printed for the consideration of the people. So this is something that was printed for people to maybe kind of think about as an option for the new country. It was written in 1786. Thomas Jefferson wanted to guarantee that all Americans could practice the religion they wanted, and he wanted to guarantee the separation of church and state. Because in England, the Church of England and the government of England were connected. They were not separate. And he thought that that was not a good way to create a government. So he created the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom to guarantee that that wouldn't happen here in America. It was the basis for the First Amendment right, freedom of religion. Fill in your notes for the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom now. Two of the founding documents were written using the inspiration of earlier documents, and they influenced the Constitution. And these two are the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. The same people who wrote the U.S. Constitution also wrote these two documents, and they used everything they had learned to write them, and then they used these two when they ended up writing the Constitution later. The Declaration of Independence was written in 1776. It was signed by all of the men at the Second Continental Congress. Here is a very famous portrait of those men. For example, we have Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and John Adams, and they are presenting the Declaration of Independence. And what this did was it officially declared the U.S. independent or separate from England. And it listed all of the reasons why we should be independent. Some famous quotes from this document are, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Self-evident is like a fancy way of saying obvious. So this is obvious. All men are created equal. Another famous quote is that all people have certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this means that everybody has these rights. They cannot be taken away. They are given to you at birth, and they cannot be taken away by any government or any person. So all people are created equal, and all people have right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In this document, Thomas Jefferson and the other men who wrote it explained their grievances or their complaints with the King of England and why they thought that they should create their own new independent government. They were declaring why they needed independence. Fill in your notes on the Declaration of Independence. The Articles of Confederation was our first constitution. So right now, our Constitution is the United States Constitution. But before that existed, we were a country living under this Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. A constitution is just a list of rules of how the government is going to be run. And this first Constitution had a very weak national government. You have to imagine that they had just been under the government of the King of England, who had a lot of power and a lot of strength as the national government. And so when they made their first constitution, remember, they were using everything they had read, everything they had experienced, everything they knew to write the first government of the U.S. And they knew they didn't want a king, so they created a very weak national government. The problem was it was way too weak. The national government couldn't tax, so they couldn't pay for things that we know our government taxes pay for now. They couldn't create currency or money for the country, and they couldn't raise an army to defend the country. And this is a political cartoon showing this ship called the Articles of Confederation and how it's not going to be able to withstand these very tall waves. These waves are the problems with our first government, with the Articles of Confederation. It was so weak, and it was too weak, so it failed, and then they had to make a new constitution, which ended up being the U.S. Constitution, the one we have right now. Fill in your notes for the Articles of Confederation now. So when the founders created the U.S. Constitution, they were influenced by a lot of earlier documents, and they used those earlier documents to create the concepts that are in our Constitution today. So, for example, the Magna Carta led to the idea of rule of law, that no one is above the law, not even the leaders of the government, not the king, not the president. They also used the charters for the Virginia Company of London, which became the rights of citizens that are listed in the Bill of Rights. They had read and created the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which eventually influenced and became the basis for the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And they had read the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and they had created this, saw that it worked, and used it to create freedom of religion, which is in the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights.